Trudeau told Canadians that he had used marijuana as an MP, we forgave him and we elected him prime minister because there was nothing to forgive, because using pot isn't a big deal and we shouldn't care. And now he's been prime minister. Since he's been prime minister, over 46,000 Canadians have been arrested for possession of marijuana.
You had to know it was coming. This was an eventuality that I was going to do a weed episode. I'm really, really happy with it. So, it's a new podcast day. Today is Dana Larsen. He is a marijuana activist and a dispensary owner in Vancouver. I saw him speak in Kelowna, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to try and interview him for the podcast. He's got a couple of different programs going on. Most notably is overgrowcanada.com. You can find him on Twitter at Dana Larsen, Larsen. I'm not going to waste a lot more time on the intro. Let's get into it. Here he is, Dana Larsen. Okay, so here we go. Welcome to another episode of Eric's Hotbox podcast. I'm joined today by a very special guest, somebody that I found out about a year or so ago. He came and did a tour in Kelowna, and it was for this program that I hadn't heard a lot about, but it was called Overgrow Canada. And what happened was I saw this newspaper article about this guy named Dana Larsen who was mailing marijuana to different politicians during the election in the federal election, and then was actually like set up this system whereby, you know, you could go online and submit your information, and then this really nice guy would mail you marijuana seeds. And that just, the concept and the idea of it really blew me away. And I was lucky enough to get him to agree to do an interview. So welcome, Dana.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
I really appreciate it. I spent a lot of time in my life arguing with people about why I should be allowed to do marijuana, like should be allowed to use marijuana at my leisure. You know, I would say the most common response that I would get is, why is it so important? Why do you need this thing in your life? You know, it's a drug that's been illegal in Canada for a number of years, and associated with a lot of negativity between people and a lot of bad stereotypes. You know, can't you just go with the things that are already there? Do you have to go and start legalizing something else? Can I get your response to something like that?
Well, I would say that it's not the cannabis advocates or those who want to legalize that are the ones that are really obsessed with cannabis. It's the prohibitionists that are obsessed with cannabis, that want to spend millions and millions of taxpayer dollars every year to harass and arrest and punish people. It's the prohibitionists who want to waste taxpayers' money, to clog up our courts, and to really just be busybodies of what people do in their own home and their own garden. And so I like to turn that argument back on people and say, you know, even though we've got the signs with the pot leaves on them and we're the ones, you know, talking about cannabis and wanting to legalize it, it's really the prohibitionists and the government that are obsessed with cannabis, finding it, rooting it out, stopping it, and going to a lot of effort on this. And the idea that, oh, we've already got alcohol and tobacco and they're bad enough, so why do you want to legalize something else? I mean, that to me is such a ridiculous argument. It's not about it's about human rights and human freedom and our ability to make our own choices with our own bodies. And logistically, cannabis is so much safer than either alcohol or tobacco is that really even comparing these things together doesn't make a lot of sense. I'd rather compare cannabis to coffee or chocolate in terms of its potential harms and risks and the kind of age limits we put on it. But yeah, it's really the people that are against cannabis that are the ones that want to spend all their time and energy and want us as a society to spend billions of dollars going after people for growing this plant in their garden. They're the ones who are obsessed with cannabis, not us.
Yeah, I was so impressed by your knowledge of Canadian cannabis law history when I saw you speak in Kelowna on your tour last time, and I've yet to pick up your book, but something that's really interested in. It was amazing to me, and I won't get you to try to reiterate the whole talk or anything like that, but how cannabis was kind of a widely used thing when the French and the British were first colonizing Canada. Do you think you could fill in a little bit of that history for people that might not know?
Well, absolutely, and thanks for plugging my book. It's Cannabis in Canada: The Illustrated History, and that's available online at my website, greenbudsandhash.com, and it covers the Canadian cannabis history from 1606 up until modern times. And just pause to roll my joint, just lick my joint there. And what I found interesting researching this book and writing it and putting it all together was how popular and what an important part of the Canadian economy and the Canadian culture cannabis has always played. And we sometimes think of cannabis in Canada as something that started in the 60s and everyone started smoking pot out of nowhere, and then the kind of all came from that. But really, for the first 200 years of Canadian history, from the 1600s and the 1700s, both the French and British governments were desperate to grow more cannabis. And not for its medicinal uses, but for the fiber and the textiles, so they could make the ropes and the sails to keep their navies going, especially Britain, which was very dependent on Russian-grown hemp to keep their navy going, and that played a big part in the Napoleonic Wars, and why Napoleon invaded Russia was to cut off Britain's supply of Russian hemp. And so in North America and South America, all the European powers are growing lots of hemp. And in fact, that's the reason why they were sending prisoners to Australia. The idea that they didn't have enough room in jails in England or something makes no sense at all. They wanted a cheap labor source, cheap workers, essentially a slave force to work on their hemp crops, because hemp was very labor intensive and a lot of colonists didn't really want to grow hemp. And so part of the idea of sending all these prisoners to Australia was to get them to work in their plan for Australian hemp fields. And in Canada, it said for 200 years, the British and the French would bribe and threaten and punish and do everything they could to Canadian farmers to get them to grow more hemp. And then during the 1800s, they finally had enough people and enough labor in Canada that the hemp industry was really be able to take off. And for the 1800s was really in some ways the golden age of cannabis in Canada, because hemp cultivation was happening in every province. There was mills in every province. And from the mid-1800s till the end of the century, cannabis medicines were also very widespread and very widely used.
So when we talk about the widespread uses of something like hemp, I mean, it's kind of old hat for some people, and I'm a little bit familiar with it, but from what I understand, hemp was like extremely difficult to break down, and so for a long time, like it was really, really hard to use it for other products, and maybe that's why it kind of fell out of favor for a little while.
Yeah, what happened was hemp was a very labor-intensive crop, and that's because the hemp fiber, the hemp stalk, is made of two parts. There's the outer ring, which is very strong, long fibers, and that's the part that people were looking to harvest and use for textiles and ropes and fabrics for thousands of years. And the inner part of the stalk is a pulpy hurd, a mass that was normally just discarded and gotten rid of. And you would do that through a process called retting or rotting, where you basically lay all the hemp in the field for a few weeks and turn it and let it get rotten a bit so that the inner pulpy part would go away, or they'd soak it in water, or they would hand break it, which was very labor intensive, and they had these big machines that they would push like a giant nutcracker, and you'd be banging it up and down to beat apart this stuff. But however you did it, it took a lot of work, a lot of effort, and so it was more of a cash crop. They weren't really eating the seeds or in that way when they're growing it from textile. So it was really just a cash crop. And so for a lot of colonists, they didn't want to grow this. Getting money when you're in a little colony in Canada is not a lot you can spend it on. You want to grow a food crop that you can eat rather than something you can sell. But it was very much a crop that required lots of labor. In the U.S., it was a slave crop, and so because they had a cheap labor source with their slaves, that they were able to process hemp. In Russia, it wasn't slavery, but it was peasants and serfs. They had a large landmass, a lot of poor peasants and laborers that would be willing to do this kind of work and wanted that money. And so those were some of the biggest sources of hemp. And then in the late 1800s, near the end of that golden age of cannabis I was talking about, hemp started falling out of favor. And it was partly because the steam engine had been invented, and so boats didn't need big sails anymore. And so although hemp was still being used for ropes on some boats, its need as a fabric to keep navies going just wasn't there anymore. And then the other thing was that the forests of the New World and new technology allowed trees to become the number one source of paper. And so instead of using old rags and hemp fabric to make paper, trees became the paper source, and that also made hemp less popular and less widely used. And finally, cotton also became more popular. And although cotton wasn't as durable as hemp fiber was, it's a bit softer, and it's also was easier to process because the cotton gin had been invented, and so cotton became much less labor intensive. And then the idea is that in the late 20s and early 30s, hemp was about to make a big comeback because new technology had been invented, a machine called the decorticator. And this machine would essentially suck out that inner pulpy herd I was talking about quickly and took away all the labor. And so not only could you get at those fibers much more quickly and easily, but you could now use that inner pulpy mass too to make stuff out of. And so there was big headlines at the time, the most famous being in Popular Mechanic, saying the new $1 billion crop, and how because this inner pulpy mass could be used to make anything that plastics are used for, it would become this incredibly valuable. And this is $1 billion in 1930s money. That's trillions of dollars in our money, right? And so around the same time that this discussion was happening and hemp was about to make this comeback, and by the way, that decorticator technology was perfected in Canada as well, in Ontario, by a Canadian farmer, Howard Fraley, who did a lot of work on it. But regardless, just as this was coming in, the marijuana panic started, and hemp and cannabis were ultimately banned in all their forms across North America. First, marijuana and hash were banned in the 20s, and then just as hemp was making its comeback, the whole plant was banned. In fact, in Canada, the year that cannabis hemp was banned, RCMP were out burning hemp fields down to the ground that farmers were growing and telling farmers this was a dangerous narcotic crop, and things really changed. And so whether it's a coincidence or a conspiracy or just convergence of interests, all these different things were happening at the same time. You know, racism and racial panic was quite common in the 20s and 30s, and plastics were also being invented. The petroleum age was beginning, and so nylon and synthetic fabrics, synthetic pharmaceutical medicines, which are also made out of petroleum, all these things were becoming competitors to cannabis. And so it's certainly plausible to speculate that that's why it happened. And there's a lot of evidence that the moneyed interests could see that the cannabis hemp comeback was going to hurt their financial interests in the new petroleum industry that was developing. And maybe that's why hemp was banned and why a lot of these things happened.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of reading and listening to different experts talk about the American system through which it became illegal, and a lot of that which had to do with William Randolph Hearst and owning a lot of pulp and paper mills and trying to eliminate the competition for building, new plants that hemp may have been able to take over after the decorticator was invented, when it dropped that level of labor-intensive requirements, and then would have been much more competitive market. But I want to jump forward now. So obviously the Liberals won the federal election, and one of their campaign promises was to introduce national marijuana legalization. And so far, from what I can understand, there's been a federal report commissioned by a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, along with some other politicians, and they tried to set up a set of guidelines and recommendations for the way that they would want legislation to be formed for the legalization of marijuana in Canada. Now, I'm sure you've read the article. The whole thing is long and boring, but for some of the major takeaways, I'm wondering what your opinion was on some of those. For example, they wanted to limit personal growing to 4 plants per household and only have them be able to be 1 meter tall, and have greater taxes on edibles and things that were of higher THC concentration. I was just wanting to get, your cursory kind of view on where that report stood.
Well, yeah, that was the task force, and they went across Canada having hearings. They didn't have any public hearings or anything like that, and, I certainly wasn't invited to offer my opinions, but they did talk to a lot of people, many of whom I know are solid, good activists that had a lot of good things to say. And overall, their recommendations, they're not perfect by any means, but in many ways they're better than I expected. I mean, you mentioned that they wanted to limit it to 4 plants of home cultivation. Well, a lot of us were afraid they were going to recommend no home cultivation be allowed at all. And although 4 plants at 1 meter each is obviously an arbitrary and kind of silly limit to put on it, it's better than 0. And so as a starting point for legalization 1.0, I'm not too upset about that. I want that number to be higher. Ultimately, I don't think there should be any limit on how much cannabis you can grow at home any more than there's a limit on anything else. Or if there is a limit, it should be like tobacco, where you can grow 30 kilos of tobacco for yourself each year if you want to. But I think that idea, to start off with, it's almost certain there's going to be some kind of plant limit in place. And although I don't think that's a long-term solution, I'm not too upset about seeing that in the short term. The idea that they want to put higher taxes on higher THC products, I think will be unsuccessful and a non-starter. And I think that although I don't mind, GST and PST and regular taxes like that on cannabis, if there's any kind of real punitive taxes or things that keep the prices very high, I'm sorry, I got that dog barking here. Do you want me to?
No problem.
Do you want me to start that again and you edit it, or do you want me just to keep going?
I'll just keep going. Know what? Right. We'll keep it going.
The idea that you want to have high prices on cannabis is not a good idea, because if it's still, like, if legalization still means the best price you can get is $5 to $10 a gram, then that's not legalization. That's really still a different form of prohibition. So I think under legalization there's room for $10 grams, because there's going to be different contexts people buy and sell cannabis in, just like there's room for $7 coffees, but there's also room for 5-cent coffees, right? You can make a coffee in your own home. You can, it's very cheap to make, but people, sometimes they choose to pay more, just like with wine. You can brew your own wine at home very cheaply. You can buy a bottle at the store for $8, or you can go to a fancy restaurant and drink a bottle of wine for $500. And it's got a lot to do with the ambiance and the circumstances, and not just the opposite. But if all wine was $500 a bottle, that would be prohibition. That would be ridiculous, right? So I think if we have home cultivation, if we have a situation where most Canadians can get cannabis for a much more reasonable price of $1 to $2 a gram, then I think there's still room for expensive cannabis out there in the right circumstance. But if they try to make it so this plant is still worth $10 a gram retail, then there's still going to be a lot of people choosing to grow it and sell it themselves, simply because of the economics of it. And so if they want to get rid of the black market, if they want to shut down every dispensary in the country, it's easy to do. Just make legal marijuana $1 a gram, and we can't compete with that. And so, raiding and arresting people and shutting them down and all this, that's not going to work. But if they did that, if there was a legal system, for me anyways, I would say that if there's a legal system out there where Canadians can access higher quality, cheaper products, and I can provide my dispensary, then we won. I don't mind shutting down if that's the case. I'm not in this so I can sell marijuana. I'm in this so that there's access to cannabis for all people under a just and fair system. And, maybe our dispensary could adapt to that kind of model. But ideally, like I say, if they want to shut down all the dispensaries, the government should be able to provide cannabis that's lower priced and higher quality with better selection than the underground market can, if they were just to do it properly. But so far, they're failing miserably. So that commission, I like a lot of their recommendations, but they've still got a lot of flaws in there. But the thing is, none of their recommendations are binding. Very often, the governments don't follow the recommendations they get. And so I really just want to wait to see what they actually do before I get too excited about what this commission is and what the task force has recommended.
Yeah, for sure. I can't say that I'm not a little bit apprehensive after what happened with Trudeau's actions on electoral reform, but I feel like his party was able to garner so much more of the popular vote through promising to, move legalization of marijuana forward, that it would be a really tough one for him to back out on at the last minute, especially after spending the money on the report already now. I was wondering if you could talk about this year's Overgrow campaign, maybe give some details to people that don't know what it is and how it's going so far.
Absolutely. Well, last year I got my hands on several million cannabis seeds, and these aren't a potent, Kush high THC variety. These are a low THC, high CBD variety that we're calling Freedom Green. And it's a variety normally grown for seed production. And when you grow cannabis for seed production, you grow big fat colas, just like marijuana, but you let them get seeded and get fertilized, and then you harvest all the seeds. And when the farmers in Canada do that, they can't actually keep the resin. They have to throw all that away. They only keep the seeds. And so this strain produces about 10% CBD under good conditions, and if you grow it without any male plants around, it'll make a nice big bud that will have a lot of resin in it. But I'm really not giving out these seeds so much for every Canadian to be able to grow some dank buds at home. I'm giving out these seeds for people to grow in public places, to normalize cannabis cultivation in public places. I want it I want to live in a Canada where when you walk down the street and you see a cannabis plant, it's not a big deal because you've seen 10 other cannabis plants that day growing in gardens and parks and other places. And every day we walk by dozens of plants that are highly toxic and dangerous and psychoactive, and then if you were to eat them or smoke them, you could die or certainly have some profound mental experiences. But nobody cares because they're just plants and it's not a big deal. And somehow cannabis has this sort of demonized aspect to it, but really it's just a plant and it should be available like any other plant. And so last year I gave away over 2.5 million seeds by mail order and in person. Doing the same thing again this year. We've already put over 1 million seeds in the mail. Everybody who signs up at overgrowcanada.com, we'll send them 100 cannabis seeds for free. We encourage people to make a $5 donation to cover the costs of mailing and packaging and everything, but you don't have to. We don't check if you donate it or not. We just send everybody seeds who ask for it. And so 10,000 people have requested seeds so far, and they're all in the mail and mostly in hands already. And I'm expecting probably another 5,000 to 10,000 will sign up over the next month or so. And then I'll be touring through 23 cities in Canada, including Kelowna, which I think I'm coming into on April 5th or 6th. You can check overgrowcanada.com. But I'll be traveling from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC, and many points in between, and giving away more seeds and talking to people. And I'm hoping to give away 5 million seeds this year instead of the 2 million we did last year. And last year during my tour, actually I got a big boost by being arrested in Calgary. It was the second stop on our tour. We came to Kelowna first and had a great event. Then we went to Calgary and had a packed room event. People couldn't fit in. They were outside the hallway, outside on the street trying to get in. It was really quite incredible. And the police came and arrested one of our volunteers for having some cannabis seeds. And so I pretty much made the police arrest me, and ultimately they let him go, and they arrested me instead. And I spent the night in jail, and I'm charged with trafficking in cannabis seeds, and I will be a hearing on May 9th and 10th about that in Calgary, and I'll be going on trial, I guess, next year if they really want to go through with it. And there's so many levels of absurdity to that, but it certainly helped the giveaway immensely. I was only going to give away 1 million seeds, and after I was arrested, we had so much interest, and international news covered it, and it was a really big deal, and we ended up being able to double our seed giveaway. And I'm going to go back to Calgary again on my tour this time. It's going to be one of the very last stops. We'll see if the Calgary police choose to arrest me again. And I'm still on bail for this, right? I have to call my bail supervisor every month and talk to them about it, and it's quite bizarre because after Calgary, I went to 17 more cities and gave away millions of more seeds to people, and nobody else arrested me, even though I was violating my bail at every stop, really, in terms of that. So it's just very ridiculous that this is even an issue. And what's really absurd or quite pressing, really, is that I was reading in the news just the other day that Alberta has dropped over 200 serious criminal charges on people because they don't have the court resources to deal with it. They dropped 45 charges that include theft and assault and like real crimes that people should be concerned of these in the last year, and they say they're overwhelmed and they can't afford their court services, and yet they've got the resources to come after me for giving away CBD cannabis seeds in a city where you can buy high-potency marijuana seeds over the counter at more than one location that have signs out front saying, come get your marijuana seeds here. So it's really an absurd situation. And if they want to drag me to the courts, I look forward to a chance to talk about how ridiculous these laws are and how stupid it is for them to be charging me for this. But really, they should be dropping these charges and moving on. If they're going to be dropping charges on people that actually are committing real crimes, then I should be near the very bottom of the list of people they have time for in the court. The guy giving away, low THC cannabis seeds should not be a high priority. Certainly not in Trudeau's Canada. But I'll be doing the tour anyways and giving away more seeds, and I'm hoping that we can get more plants growing all across the country.
Yeah, that's something that I found a little bit frustrating. Justin Trudeau saying in Parliament that, because marijuana is illegal now, police and law enforcement should be enforcing the law as it stands and conducting all their same things. And yet Justin Trudeau admitted to using marijuana while he was a sitting member of Parliament. And so I feel like he's having his cake and eating it too by saying, well, still arrest all the people that aren't me for using this drug, but I'll win votes and tell you about how I used it in order to garner support and attention throughout my campaign to win office. I thought that was really disingenuous.
I absolutely agree. And when Trudeau told Canadians that he had used marijuana as an MP, we forgave him and we elected him Prime Minister because there was nothing to forgive, because using pot isn't a big deal and we shouldn't care. And now he's been Prime Minister. Since he's been Prime Minister, over 46,000 Canadians have been arrested for possession of marijuana. Not all of them got charged. Most of them didn't get charged. Probably only 1 in 6 or so got charged. But these are people for whom the reason they were being arrested, the most significant thing, was possession of cannabis. It wasn't they were being busted for something else and they found a joint on them. That's 46,000 people arrested, humiliated by police, who have distrust now for the police. It's millions and millions of dollars and hours for the police. Each one of those arrests involved them sitting down and writing a report on why they took Johnny's gram of marijuana away from him. And the whole thing is absurd that this is continuing. And Trudeau really, as Canadians or as cannabis Canadians, I think we can wait a while for legalization to come into place. We understand that putting all the rules and regulations around selling and marketing cannabis might take a little while. But we don't need the government's help to get good marijuana. We never have needed the government's help to get good marijuana. They want to put some reasonable rules in, great. They can do that. We'll help them write them. But our immediate concern, the number one issue, is to stop arresting people for nonviolent crimes, which includes cannabis smoking, cannabis use, and small-scale cannabis dealing. And Trudeau could have, on day one, which Mulcair said he would do. Admittedly, Tom Mulcair's messaging was a bit erratic on cannabis during the election, but he did say more than once that as Prime Minister on day one, he would stop arrests for simple possession of cannabis. And that kind of decriminalization, not give people tickets or make it a different kind of penalty, but just if you've got 30 grams or less, the police leave you alone. And if you've got 4 plants or 6 plants or less or whatever the arbitrary number is for your own use, they leave you alone for that too. That's not the final solution, but it's a great first step. And it would have stopped 46,000 arrests, a lot more people being harassed for small quantities who weren't necessarily arrested or recorded. And it would just be a big sigh of relief for all Canadians that, yeah, we've had some progress. Because right now we're still living under Stephen Harper's drug laws. Trudeau hasn't even rolled back the mandatory minimums that Stephen Harper passed when he was Prime Minister. Some of them have been weakened in the courts, and the courts have said those mandatory minimums are unconstitutional. But Trudeau hasn't repealed a single one. And really, even that would have been a good first step, just to say, okay, we're not going to put these mandatory minimums in place anymore. I and every other dispensary operator in Canada qualify for some very severe mandatory minimum sentences. And the fact that we qualify for them, but nobody's charging us with them, is also kind of absurd. Like, they only apply to certain people. If you're disenfranchised or if you're a First Nations person in the North, then these things come after you. But if you're a middle-class, high-profile person in Vancouver, nothing happens. Like, as you mentioned, I've mailed weed to Trudeau, and every single MP of the Liberals, I mailed a half ounce of weed to Christy Clark, and nothing happens to me. Not that I want to get arrested, but I'm sure if I'm some kid in the North, in Yellowknife or something, who gets busted for a couple of joints in my pocket, and I get arrested for this, I'll be going, what the hell? Dana can send pot to people, nothing happens to him. Like, what kind of stupid system is this? Our Prime Minister can smoke pot, nothing happens to him. So Trudeau has to make this change, and I think that it's going to be a while before we see anything happen. And I think that when this spring and summer and fall come and pass, and arrests are still happening, and the law hasn't changed yet, and we get into next year and the law hasn't changed yet, I think regular Canadians are going to start getting a little pissed off and wondering what's going on. I think most of them are expecting change this spring or this summer, and it's not going to come, and there's going to be a lot of disappointment and confusion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the clock is ticking when it comes to really deciding to stand on one side of the fence or the other when it comes to whether or not the future of like marijuana legalization in Canada is going to keep moving forward. I think personally one of the biggest things holding back that movement for the people that still stand on the other side of it is an unfounded moral judgment on people that use marijuana, that you're going to be lazy, you're not going to contribute to society, and all these kinds of things. You know, my hometown of Saskatoon and Kelowna are statistically the two cities in Canada where you're most likely to actually like get arrested and like face criminal charges if you're caught with pot on you. How do you think that moral judgment can kind of be swayed from the public opinion? You know, do you feel like there's still a big generation of people that are going to be looked down upon because they're cannabis smokers, and how does that change for the next generation of users?
Well, I think that's very valid what you're saying, and I think that people generally don't make their decisions on facts, they make them on emotions. And so for a lot of people, I think cannabis, they've been trained to have negative emotional responses to cannabis. People say, oh, I hate the smell of cannabis. It's terrible. Well, it doesn't actually smell that bad. In fact, it can smell quite pleasant to a lot of people. But if you associate it with criminality, with violence, with dangerous people, then those associations make that smell unpleasant to you. And I think that, we have the DARE program in our schools. We have had a steady media campaign. I saw dozens and dozens of anti-cannabis ads when I was a kid portraying cannabis users and cannabis sellers as awful people who are trying to get you hooked on this dangerous thing and who just want to addict you to this substance. And so I think that it's those emotional attitudes. You can tell somebody, well, it's safer than alcohol, it's safer than tobacco, and those logical arguments don't always impact people in an emotional place because they just have a negative reaction to it. And so that's why I think the idea of medical cannabis has been so influential, because it's changed the frame around cannabis. It's no longer a hedonistic substance that we're just using for pleasure because we're too lazy to get a job or something. It's about sick people needing this plant medicine to be healthy. And so when you see a grandmother or an epileptic child or somebody who's a quote unquote normal class person using cannabis who's got these severe ailments, that becomes much more difficult to be against. And that's why we see politicians now all the time like, well, I'm not against medical marijuana, but I still think, legalization is too much. And it's a bizarre dichotomy that this substance, for the epileptic child or the arthritic grandmother is a good medicine, but then when they pass that joint or that vaporizer to someone who's not sick, suddenly it becomes this dangerous substance. But we see that transition and that change in attitudes. And I think that reframing cannabis is going to be more effective in terms of how people see it than just trying to convince them with logic and numbers that how good cannabis is and how it's a beneficial substance. But I think that the biggest thing is whether you have personal experience with it or not. And that goes for any group. If you've never met any gay people or any black people or any cannabis users or any whoever's, it's easy to think of them all as one big lump and they're all the same, and I have this stereotypical attitude toward those people. And then you go, oh, wait a minute. You're gay? Oh, you're black, but you don't seem like you're really black. Like, you're different, right? Or you smoke pot, but and then you start to be like, well, actually, people are just people, and that there's no, these preconceptions and stereotypes you have fall apart in the face of real people and all of their complexities and all of the things that they do. And I think that for a lot of people, cannabis has been underground, so they don't talk about how they're a user of it, and now it's more open, and people can go, oh, you're a user? Oh, but you're not what I thought a cannabis user was like. My mom has never used cannabis in her life. She's a pretty straight-edge person. She loves me, and I've helped educate her about cannabis, but never in her life did she expect that so many of her friends would be going to her, hey, can you get your son to get me some of those cannabis cookies? My wife got really sick and she needs some, or my arthritis needs some, or can you get some of that cream from him? And she's kind of becoming a cannabis dealer, a medical cannabis dealer to many of her senior citizen friends. And even though she's seen me her whole life, it's still changing her opinions even now that her 70 and 80-year-old friends are bugging her to get medical cannabis from me that she's never used, even though she's not against it because she understands me and she loves me, but she's not a cannabis person. And so it's interesting. I think more and more people, when you realize, oh, you're a cannabis user, and that 12-year-old girl's a cannabis user, and it keeps her alive, and that person is, then your attitude changes. And so I think that the normalization of it and people coming out of the closet, just like when somebody's against gay marriage and their gay kid wants to get married, and they go, well, okay, when it's my kid, like, it just changes it, right? And I think that's happening with cannabis.
Yeah, I think always the toughest person to try to convince that something is not as evil as it might seem is everyone's own mother. And so that sort of calm dialogue and normalization of the benefits of it can be really helpful. I think one of the other really beautiful things about it is that you mentioned that you could be surprised by the amount and types of people that can be marijuana users. I think that speaks largely to the fact that it's a plant that can help so many diverse things that come up in a person's life that might be expected, whether or not it's arthritis or somebody has different anxiety problems or headaches or, any of the countless things that it can help with. I think it's a really amazing thing that there's one plant that can do so many individual treatments for people.
I think you're right, and what's interesting about that, because people often say, oh yeah, sure, cannabis can cure cancer, it'll fix your AIDS, it'll help you with your eczema, like sure, it's a bunch of baloney, you guys are just saying that to get high. How can one thing have so many different effects? But what we're discovering is that the body's endocannabinoid system, our natural system of receptors, which we're only beginning to understand, and which the cannabis plant plugs into, that system is involved in homeostasis. And homeostasis means bringing things back to the center. And that is what is required for all life to exist. It's got to be, if something gets too hot, you got to be able to cool it down. And if it gets too cold, you got to be able to warm it up. And if it gets too, much salt, you got to be able to reduce it. It's all about having that middle balance and that place where life can exist to create those conditions. That is called homeostasis. So unlike things like cocaine, which put you in one direction, up, or opiates, which put you in one direction, cannabis brings you to the middle. And so that's why you can't overdose on cannabis. That's why you can't die from it, because it's not just pushing you in one direction where you suddenly go in that direction too far. And that's why it can help such a wide range of ailments, because it helps bring everything back to the center. And we're still learning how that works, but I think that's a really important concept for people to keep in mind when they're talking about cannabis. That's why it can do different things. It can help you sleep, but it can also help you have more energy and stay awake. It can do a lot of different things depending on how you use it, because on what you need and where you're unbalanced. But I think that's what makes it so remarkable. And we're still learning all the different cannabinoids. We've only really begun to understand THC, the most famous cannabinoid. Now we're learning about CBD, which is becoming popular because it has much less psychoactive effects, but still a lot of medicinal effects. And we're learning that CBD plus THC is actually very effective as a medicine. And now we're learning about CBN and CBG and CBC and this whole alphabet soup of CB something molecules that what we're finding is that although they all have individual properties, they all help each other to do better together. And that's called the entourage effect. And so THC plus CBD is better than either one alone. And with the other cannabinoids mixed in there, that's good too. And I think in the future we'll start finding that the right ratios and the perfect combinations of these things to target certain ailments or to maximize human health. But it is truly remarkable the benefits of cannabis medicines. And that's why I say that cannabis is the world's greatest plant, because no other plant has not only the medicinal benefits of cannabis, but also the nutritional benefits of the seed, also the industrial and environmental benefits of the fibers. All of these things together, I think, make cannabis the world's most useful and most valuable plant of any that's out there at all.
Yeah, it's amazing the vast number of things that can be brought, like you said, from the fibers and the resins and the nutrition of the seeds and things. You mentioned the alphabet soup of some of the chemicals that are inside marijuana. A lot of people, I'm sure, maybe not, but might think that the only thing inside marijuana when you use it that's going to affect you is THC. And now you obviously just discussed that that's not the case. We, as a scientific community, have the most knowledge on THC and CBD. Can you talk about the difference between those a little bit, and why they're regarded in a different way and how they might affect a person in a different way?
Absolutely. Well, THC and all these cannabinoids, they all come in their own different variant forms too. So there's delta-9 THC, which is the most common one, but there's also delta-11, and there's THC acid and THC-VA and all these other variants. But the basic way of understanding it is that THC was the first cannabinoid that was isolated and discovered, and it's one of the most prevalent in most of the cannabis plants that we grow. And it forms in the resins of the plant, these tiny little stalks, that little sparkly resin glands that form on the plant. If you look at them under a microscope, they look like sort of a mushroom heads with a long stalk. And they're full of resin, sticky resin, and you can extract that resin in different ways, but that resin is where all these cannabinoids are formed. And so THC is the most famous one, and because it was the only one that was known for a long time, breeders of cannabis would be measuring the THC levels in their buds to produce more potent and stronger THC and more potent buds. And because they didn't know about other cannabinoids really, they weren't testing for them. And now we've discovered hundreds of cannabinoids, and the most famous other one from THC is CBD. And CBD is also very prevalent in our plants. And in fact, when we grow hemp in Canada, when farmers are growing hemp, the botanical definition of hemp and marijuana, they're all cannabis. They're all crossed with each other. There's no firm dividing line between these things. It's a continuum. But what makes hemp under the law is that it has very low levels of THC in it, and the breeders do that by breeding it to produce more CBD. And so what our farmers in Canada are growing are essentially high CBD cannabis plants, and those are the kind of seeds that I'm giving away, that are primarily bred to grow seeds themselves for food production in Canada. And so the other cannabinoids, CBN, CBG, CBC, like cannabichromene, cannabinol, CBD is cannabidiol, THC is tetrahydrocannabinol. So these are all these different molecules with the cannaba in their name somewhere, right? But CBD is very effective medically, and for things like reducing tumors and destroying cancer cells. They're finding that CBD and THC together have the optimal effects. And you can argue about which ratio is better, 2 to 1 of one to the other, or 1 to 1 ratio or whatever, but we're finding that together they work better. And CBD also, even for the psychoactive effects of cannabis, they're finding that really high levels of THC, for some users, they want that. But for a lot of people, just doing really high THC is actually not so pleasant, and it produces feelings of paranoia and nervousness and anxiety sometimes. And that when you have CBD and THC together in the buds, so when you smoke it, or the dabs or the hash or whatever form you take in, those two things are combined, the CBD modulates the THC so that you get a more pleasant experience. And there's less anxiety and less paranoia and less of those kind of unpleasant feelings, and the feelings are more positive and more beneficial. And I think that's part of the reason that people sometimes feel they're having a panic attack, or they feel unpleasant, because for so long breeders didn't know what CBD was, and there was no demand for it, so they were breeding their plants to be as high as possible in THC, which usually means they're very low in CBD. And while for plenty of folks that's good medicine, and high THC products certainly have their place, but I think for a lot of people, putting some CBD back into the plant is probably a better option, both for medical purposes and just for recreational, enjoying the good feelings that cannabis brings. And I definitely, more and more breeders out there are now producing high CBD strains, or strains that are 50-50 crosses, and I think that's going to be a big thing in the future. And I think that probably every few years, for the next few decades, we're going to be like, oh, now CBG is the big cannabinoid, and have you heard about CBG and what it can do? And, oh, but CBCs are really good. And we're going to be seeing this discussion as we start to isolate and learn about these cannabinoids and what they can do. I think I would not be surprised if in a few years some breeders are trying to grow high CBG strains, for instance. And CBG is only there in very low quantities in most cannabis strains. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this all progresses, and all these cannabinoids and all their different facets are going to provide a lot of good medicines for people all around the world that are very cheap and affordable and effective.
Yeah, I was introduced to marijuana in high school, but like I'm sure a lot of people are, from friends at a party, and it's been a really interesting kind of journey from when every user discovers that it's, number one, not going to kill you and not make you go insane and not make you get high and then never be never be sober ever again, and all the scary things that people worry about. The combination of having modern science and technology to find and discover more information about the helpful benefits of cannabis, plus the movement towards legalization, is something that, frankly, I wasn't really ever sure that I would see even in my lifetime, given the history of laws and leaders and things that went through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and stuff. Before the Liberals were elected, were you hopeful when you started your career in cannabis activism, let's say? Like, did you think that you would see full legalization?
Well, I've been doing this for about 25 years now, right? I started in high school, actually, writing letters to members of parliament and asking them about cannabis laws. In university at Simon Fraser and University in Burnaby, I started a club called the League for Ethical Action on Drugs, and we put on events, and some of the earliest rallies in Vancouver I was involved in helping organize. This is like the late 80s and early 90s I was doing this kind of work, so that's maybe almost 30 years. Oh my God. But you know, and when I first started, people would often say, oh, it's going to be legalized soon. It's inevitable. You know, why, it's going to happen soon. Why are you worried about it? I've never thought it was going to happen soon. Even now, I don't really think it's going to happen soon. It's still going to be several more years, I think. And so I've always been optimistic that I think we would come to some sort of legalization, and especially after seeing California legalize medical marijuana in the mid-90s was our first actual victory in North America for our movement, and that's really been in the U.S. But no, I've always believed that we were going to get to this eventually, and hopefully in my lifetime. And I think I still got quite a few years left. And for me, it's not just about the war on cannabis. I'm interested in ending the whole war on drugs and the whole idea that we're going to have prohibition on what plants you can grow in your garden and what herbal medicines you can use, and that these culturally relevant, medicinally beneficial, and culture, socially important plants that have been used for thousands of years are being prohibited is an aberration, I think, a historical aberration that needs to come to an end. And so I'm not in this just to legalize marijuana. I want to an end to the war on coca leaf and on opium poppies and on psilocybin mushrooms and peyote cactus. Doesn't mean I want them all regulated and treated the same as cannabis. I don't think you should be able to buy a syringe full of heroin in the store the same way I think you should be able to buy a big joint or a block of hash. But I do think that safe dosages of opiates should be legally available to adults, and that people who need stronger dosages perhaps should have to get a prescription or a medical access in some way. But I don't believe in criminalizing people for what drugs they use or how they use them. And I think the war on drugs has been remarkably damaging to our society and to our planet. It's a real war that involves real troops and real bullets and real people being killed every day all around the world in this war on drugs. It's not a metaphorical war. It's a very real war. And so to me, ending the war on cannabis is the first and biggest step, because although the rhetoric of the war on drugs is against the harder drugs or some of the other substances, in practice, it's all against marijuana users because there's so many more of us. And so 90% of the budget in terms of arrests and prosecutions and police time, it's all against the marijuana people, just because there's so many of us out there. There's so many grow rooms. There's so many people growing and using marijuana. It's an endless supply of police work for them to be engaged in. But in my history book, too, I talk about the war on opium and how that started. And just like the war on cannabis, the war on opium was not based on some kind of scientific research or study or caring about people and trying to help them in some way. The war on opium started to get Chinese people out of Canada as fast as possible. And it was purely a scapegoating effort to attack Chinese and minority populations. And in America, it was similar, and also against black people as well, and Hispanics and Mexicans, and it's all been a racist effort. So the idea that the war on drugs is some kind of well-intentioned mistake or that they had a noble basis to it is a bunch of crap. It's been a racist, violent, destructive enterprise since the beginning, and I want to see an end to it all. And will I see that in my lifetime? Probably not. But I do think we're going to see legal cannabis in Canada and in a majority of American states in our lifetime. I do think within the next 10 years or so, I think it's quite likely. I mean, it's hard to look ahead, but I think it's quite likely that if America elects, if there is still an America after Trump, and if they elect a Democrat, I can see them. I can see the possibility of America ending their federal prohibition of cannabis within 10 years. That wouldn't mean the states would end it, because each state could still do their own thing. But I wouldn't be. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if the next Democratic candidate includes marijuana legalization in their platform in the same way that Justin Trudeau did. And I see a lot of parallels between Harper and Trump in terms of how they govern and trying to break established norms and sort of breaking the traditions of government, but not really the rules, but sort of doing things in a different way like Harper would do. So I think we're going to see it, but it's going to be a while. And even in Canada, it's going to be a while. But what excites me more than the politicians is what we're doing ourselves. Because real legalization is the fact that you can buy cannabis at over 100 shops in Vancouver and at over another 200 to 300 shops across Canada. That's legalization. And Trudeau had nothing to do with that. No politician, except maybe municipal politicians, had anything to do with that. Even the municipal ones ultimately often had no choice. Vancouver politicians are not licensing dispensaries because they love dispensaries. They're licensing dispensaries because it's a last-ditch attempt to get control over something they've lost control of. And I think that's the same reason Trudeau's talking about it federally. It's because they've lost control of this industry. They've lost control of prohibition, and that's due to civil disobedience and a court system that refuses to give us harsh punishments for cannabis offenses.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I really appreciate you doing this interview. I have two more questions for you. My second last question is, are you worried about Kevin O'Leary's move towards getting the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada? And the last question is, if you could smoke a joint with anyone living or dead, who would it be?
Oh, well, okay. So the first one there, Kevin O'Leary. Yeah, I mean, I worry about him because we've got two governing parties in Canada. The NDP, although I'm a member, realistically, we're probably not going to be forming government in the next election. Although, I'm working for that. But traditionally, the Liberals and the Conservatives take turns. And so whoever becomes the Conservative leader is as long as they stay on long enough, is more than likely to become Prime Minister at some point. Certainly have a good chance of that. And I don't really like Kevin O'Leary very much. I don't like what's her name, Kathy Leach or Leach either very much either, of course. And none of them. I mean, I don't really support any of them. I guess if I had to pick one, I'd go with Maxime Bernier because he talks about legalizing marijuana. I don't agree with him on a lot of other stuff, but as a Conservative leader, if I had to pick one, I'd probably pick him. But yeah, I do worry about O'Leary, and I worry about him and Le Pen and Trump and Brexit and this sort of wave of right-wing, alt-right kind of neo-Nazi. I mean, I'm not sure Kevin O'Leary is neo-Nazi, but he's a mini-Trump, and I don't like that. So that does worry me. But at the same time, Trudeau, I like how he looks. I like what he says most of the time, but what he does isn't really that different than what other people do or than what Harper's done. And so, Trudeau's talked a good game on marijuana, but we're still living under Harper's laws. Trudeau talks a lot less enthusiastically about pipelines than Harper does, but he still supports them. Trudeau's agreeing to let American agents into Canada, to armed agents in Canada that don't have Canadian laws applying to them at border crossings, at bus stations and train stations and anything else that crosses into the U.S., which is something started by Harper, and Trudeau's now signed off on it, and I don't think Canadians are comfortable with that. So there's a lot of issues around Trudeau as well. But I do worry about Kevin O'Leary probably more than I would worry about Trudeau in terms of the future of Canada. And I'm going to smoke a joint with anybody, living or dead or anything. I don't know, I guess. I mean, I'm going to assume that the language barrier, that the magic that brings this person back from the dead would also eliminate language barriers. Then I would pick Jesus, if such a person existed. Because I read a lot of research from people who seem quite intelligent that Jesus used cannabis to heal people and that Jesus talked about cannabis and that was using cannabis ointment. So I wouldn't mind smoking a joint with the guy and finding out if that's the case or if he even existed or what he had to say. And I'm sure that would be fun. But if he could only speak Aramaic or whatever, then that would not work out so well. And maybe Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a very intelligent guy whose Cosmos books and writings and life I admire. And he didn't come out as a cannabis user during his life, but he wrote a lot about it that came out after he died. And I think he would have been a remarkable person to have a good stoned conversation with sometime. I think that Carl Sagan and Jesus and a big joint would be a great way to spend an afternoon.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Thank you very, very much for your time, Dana. Is there anything else that you want to let listeners know about, where they can find you, or the Overgrow campaign, or any of that sort of stuff?
Let me plug some websites. Well, I've written a few books. The Cannabis History book. I've also got some parody books, Green Buds and Hash, The Pie-Eyed Piper, and Harry Pothead and the Marijuana Stone, and many more books to come. You can get them all at greenbudsandhash.com. sensiblebc.ca is our organization, our lobby and activist organization. You can join up there. Overgrowcanada.com is where you can go to sign up for your free 100 cannabis seeds. You can also find out where I'm going to be on tour there as well, and come meet me if I come near your town. I sell, we didn't talk about it here too much, but I run a business that sells cannabis-infused creams and salves. It's at mjcreams.ca, and we do mail order all across Canada. And we'll send you some free samples as long as you cover, I think, like $5 shipping or something. We'll send you some free samples of our cream. And what else have I got? DanaLarsen.com. You can find out about me and my personal work there. My last name's Larsen, so DanaLarsen.com. And I probably got some other websites I'm forgetting. Also, if you need marijuana anywhere in Canada, my dispensary, cannabisdispensary.ca. We do not require medical diagnosis anymore. As long as you're an adult and proof to us you're an adult with some ID, we will mail order you cannabis, edibles, hash, and extracts anywhere in Canada at cannabisdispensary.ca. So that's, I think, all my projects. Thanks so much for having me on your show and giving me a chance to talk about the work that I do.
I really, really appreciate it. You're by far my most nationally prolific guest. So thanks a lot for taking the time out of your busy day.
Hey, my pleasure. Take care. Good luck to you.
Okay, thanks. Doesn't that feel better? Everybody got a little bit of information. Everybody got a little bit more comfortable talking about weed. Now, I understand there's probably the majority of the people that are going to listen to this have probably tried pot before, and this is kind of old hat stuff. But I guess if I was going to direct this episode towards anyone, it would hopefully be to somebody that doesn't have any experience with it. So if that's you and you're listening to this thinking like, yeah, okay, it's all well and good that, you know, they think that legalization is a good idea, but it's just not for them. Well, I encourage you to still try it out. If you have hesitations about it or you're nervous about it, understand that, you know, no one's ever overdosed on marijuana. It's been in use for over 5,000 years, and you can't smoke too much of it so that you die. You can't smoke so much of it that you never come back. Usually you're looking at, for smoking, you're looking at about like a 2.5 hour investment. Edibles are a different monster. Monster's a bad word to use, but you know, you're looking at a longer commitment with an edible. So I would say if you're going to dip your toe into the world of cannabis, start with smoking or vaporizing if you don't want to smoke it. You know, there's all kinds of good things might come into your life just with the relaxation aspect of it and looking at things in the world just a little bit differently. I enjoy it. It's something I find really relaxing and kind of drowns out the background noise of a busy day. So if you ever want to talk more about it with me or anything, send me a message on Facebook, or you can send an email to ericshotboxpodcast@gmail.com. I'm more than happy to talk to people about it in any respect. I don't know if I have anything else going on. As far as the podcast is going, I keep picking up guests here and there. I don't know if I'm going to have all kinds of episodes with any sort of regularity, but anyway, I guess subscribe to the YouTube page. That's the best way to do it. I'll keep posting updates on Facebook. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have for today. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. And until next time, talk to you later.